7 months into the conflict, and with the back-to-the-wall Kremlin leaders issuing near-daily nuclear threats, Putin vowed to protect the newly annexed regions by all available means. Ukraine's president immediately responded by applying to join NATO's military alliance, pitting Russia against the West. For the past few months, the internet has been buzzing with news and updates about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have shared a turbulent history that dates back 1,000 years, and they still haven't entirely untangled that history and turned to their separate ways. After more than 7 months, on day 254 of this combat, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is now seen warning Ukrainian civilians from the Kherson province to be evacuated from the conflict zone. But how did this all begin? The invasion and the escalation of the fights that started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Welcome back to Military Future. In this video, we will take you through the incidents from the beginning of Russia's undeclared war, the 2014 Ukraine crisis, how the war began with Russia. With the USSR getting dissolved in 1991, things took quite a turn for the now 15 independent countries. That year, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev announced that after 74 years, one of the world's most powerful nations no longer existed. The flag of the USSR was lowered for the last time, and the nation was separated into 15 independent countries. The independent nations now have the freedom to govern themselves for the first time in generations. Ukraine at the time was the second most powerful Soviet republic with the large industrial complexes and military installations. Ukraine was left with a massive pile of Soviet weaponry from the USSR. In 1994, Ukraine signed a treaty to dismantle its nuclear arsenal and joined the NPT. It's a treaty that aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and pledges to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. With the NPT, Ukraine also signed another treaty known as the Budapest Memorandum, an agreement by all 4 countries to recognize and protect Ukraine's sovereignty, giving the country the protection it needed to give up its weapons safely. Skipping to the 21st century, Viktor Yushchenko wanted to strengthen his ties to the West and Russia. Soon when the time for his elections came round, Yushchenko was poisoned, and even though he survived the assassination, Viktor Yanukovych won the election, but it was suspected that it was not fair play. Widespread reports of intimidation and corruption rose at the polls, which eventually led to the cancellation of that election round by the European Union. But Russia supported Ukraine with their newly elected president. The Orange Revolution came into the scene, and huge protests took to the streets. The protests worked, and after a month, Ukraine's parliament nullified the second round of the election and announced an election rerun. Again, the votes were counted, but the original decision was overturned this time. Yushchenko, even though poisoned and still recovering, won the election fair and square. Defeated candidate Yanukovych tried his luck again in the 2010 election, and this time he won fair and square too. His winning was great for Russia, and he pledged to create closer ties with Putin in the coming years of his power. Within a few years into his presidency, he suddenly decided to not sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. He cancelled the signing at the last minute and instead announced that he intended to join Customs Union of Russia. Most of the public was again outraged and took to the streets, but this time, the protests did not turn out to be as peaceful as the previous ones, and by mid-January 2014, there were several deaths during each protest. By the end of February, the president had fled the capital. In the end, 108 protesters died, 1,900 were injured, and 300 went missing. The parliament eventually impeached Yanukovych, and he resurfaced in Russia, claiming he was overthrown. Putin hadn't yet intervened much in Ukraine's politics, but that also changed by the end of February when Putin met with his advisors and said, "We must start working on returning Crimea to Russia." Taking advantage of the chaos has developed in Ukraine, Russia's army quietly moved into Crimea. They captured key checkpoints in the area and cut off roads to Ukraine. Within a few hours, Crimea was completely isolated from Ukraine, and even its TV channels were severed from Ukraine's local media cable. In a few months, Crimea was totally under Russian control. With Crimea out of the way, Putin focused on his next goal. The conflict began in April of 2014 between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatist rebels who seized control of several towns in predominantly Russian-speaking eastern Ukraine. It has since escalated to an unannounced war between Russia and Ukraine. Thousands of Russian troops had gathered near the rebels' border, and for months, Ukraine did not act aggressively against these insurgents. Everyone wanted to work out a peace agreement. The situation deteriorated in early July when the Ukrainian government launched an offensive to expel the insurgents. Are you enjoying the video so far? Well, we'd love to hear your opinion, so comment below and tell us what you think about the 2014 Ukraine crisis. Like, share and subscribe to our channel for more such videos on the Russia-Ukraine war. While the United States and Europe are outraged and punishing Russia with economic sanctions, they have no plans to intervene because putting Western troops in direct combat with Russian troops would increase the risk of World War III. As a result, nothing can stop the Russian tanks. Despite President Vladimir Putin's claims that Russia is not invading eastern Ukraine, Russian troops, tanks, and self-propelled artillery have crossed the border since mid-August in what can only be described and called a hostile invasion. There are two ways to interpret Putin's actions: a rational strategic effort to take something from Ukraine, or a less rational action motivated by domestic Russian politics. On the surface, the Russian invasion appears to be aimed at bolstering pro-Russian separatists in East Ukraine, who began losing ground in early August when the Ukrainian military launched a new offensive against them. According to this viewpoint, Russian troops are present to prevent the rebels from being completely overrun. Putin has been supporting from the separatists in inciting violence in eastern Ukraine for months. He's doing it to either maintain a perpetual separatist crisis, as he did in Georgia and Moldova, so that he has leverage over the Ukrainian government to give himself an excuse to invade under the guise of saving eastern Ukrainians. Then, as he did in Crimea, annex that territory. Or, on the other hand, the other possibility is that he wishes to compel the Ukrainian government and the West to make a concession. Putin has governed through an implicit agreement with the Russian people since taking power in 2000. He has delivered high economic growth in exchange for curbs on political and individual rights. However, after the economy slowed and some Russians protested his sham re-election in 2012, Putin shifted tactics, focusing on installing anti-Western paranoia and imperial-style Russian nationalism. The first obvious reason for the protests was the President Yanukovych had rejected a deal for greater EU integration, instead accepting a $15 billion bailout from Russia. Many Ukrainians desired the EU agreement, partly because they believed it would help Ukraine's troubled economy, and partly because they saw closer ties with Europe as culturally and politically desirable. The second, more serious reason for the protests was that they saw many Ukrainians saw Yanukovych as corrupt, autocratic, and Russian stooge. Yanukovych attempted to end the protests by sending the dreaded Berkut internal security forces to crack down, then passing laws restricting Ukrainians' fundamental freedoms of expression and assembly. Both of these only exacerbated the protests. In February, the parliament voted to strip Yanukovych of his powers, ended the crackdown, and remove him entirely. Not everyone in Ukraine supported the protests or their agenda. Euromaidan also included far-right ultra-nationalist groups, some of which were violent. As a result, the Russian government and some Ukrainians, particularly the more Russian-speaking East, see the protests as effectively depriving Russian-speaking Ukrainians of their citizenship. Little has gone according to plan since Vladimir Putin ordered his tanks to enter the Ukrainian border in February. Before Ukraine launched effective counteroffensive in the east and south, Russians' blitzkrieg failed and the conflict dragged on for months in a grinding stalemate. There is a lot of uncertainty about the war's conclusion, and Mr. Putin is under pressure. His frantic announcement of partial mobilization sparked demonstrations across Russia, and the unlawful annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces was met with condemnation on a global scale. But with that said, that will be all for today's video. Thank you so much for joining us and thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video, share the content, and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying, and click the bell icon for updates on our latest videos. That's all from us at Military Future. We'll see you in the next video.